High on a hill in 1854 Georgia, where the morning mist clung to ancient oak trees like ghostly fingers, stood a house that commanded both respect and fear. The Maddox estate loomed over the small town below, its imposing silhouette cutting against the pale sky like a wound in the horizon. From a distance it appeared magnificent, 3 stories of weathered brick and ornate ironwork, with sprawling gardens that once bloomed with southern elegance. But something was wrong with this picture of prosperity. The townspeople had learned to avert their eyes when they passed beneath its shadow. They noticed things. Shutters that remained locked even on the brightest summer days. Windows that reflected nothing but darkness, as if the house itself refused to let light escape. And then there were the sounds that drifted down the hill on still nights, sounds that made mothers pull their children closer and fathers reach for their rifles. The cries were faint, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. But those who heard them never forgot. They spoke of voices calling out in the darkness, of sounds that seemed almost human but carried something else entirely, something desperate, something trapped. The house stood like a sentinel against the sky, watching over the town with windows that never blinked, keeping secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. And behind those locked shutters, a family was about to prove that sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the most terrible truths. The Maddox name carried weight in these parts, had done so for generations. They were landowners in the truest sense, their holdings stretched across thousands of acres, their influence reaching into every corner of the county. In public, they were the picture of Southern aristocracy. Thomas Maddox, the family patriarch, conducted business with the measured precision of a man who had never known defeat. His wife, Eleanor, moved through social gatherings like a queen among subjects, her smile as perfect and cold as marble. Their children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, were rarely seen in town. When they did appear, always flanked by their parents, they stood silent as statues. Their eyes held an odd quality, as if they were looking at the world from behind thick glass. Neighbors would later remember how they never played with other children, never laughed, never seemed to truly breathe. The same air as everyone else. The Maddoxes built their reputation on control. Every aspect of their lives was orchestrated with military precision. Every conversation was measured. Every emotion was contained. They spoke of family honor as if it were a living thing that required constant feeding, constant protection. And, perhaps in their minds, it did. Thomas would often tell business associates that the Maddox bloodline was special, refined through generations of careful breeding and strict discipline. He believed that weakness was a disease that could be cured through proper treatment. Eleanor would nod approvingly during these conversations, her hands folded primly in her lap, her eyes revealing nothing of what she truly thought. But control, when taken to its extreme, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a prison where the guards and the prisoners wear the same face. And in the Maddox household, that transformation was already well underway. Inside the Maddox house, silence reigned supreme. The grand hallways that should have echoed, with children's laughter instead absorbed every sound like a tomb. Servants moved through the rooms on silent feet, their eyes downcast, their voices never rising above a whisper. They learned quickly that noise was not tolerated in the Maddox household. Neither was curiosity. Entire sections of the house remained locked away from prying eyes. The 3rd floor was completely sealed, its doors reinforced with heavy iron brackets. That seemed more suited to a prison than a home. The basement, too, was forbidden territory. Only Thomas and Eleanor held the keys, and they guarded them with the fervor of centuries protecting state secrets. The servants whispered among themselves when they thought no one was listening. They spoke of strange deliveries that arrived under cover of darkness, heavy wooden crates that required multiple men to carry, their contents unknown and unquestioned. They told stories of rooms where the walls seemed to absorb screams, where the very air felt thick with suffering. Martha, the head housekeeper, would cross herself whenever she passed the locked doors on the 3rd floor. She had worked for wealthy families before, but never had she encountered rooms that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. The newer servants often asked about those sealed chambers, but Martha had learned the value of ignorance. Some knowledge, she understood, was too dangerous to possess. but perhaps most disturbing were the punishments. When a Maddox child broke one of the family's sacred rules, spoke too loudly, asked too many questions, or dared to venture where they shouldn't, they would simply disappear, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. When they returned, they were changed, quieter, more distant, as if something vital had been carefully extracted from their souls. The younger servants would notice the children's pale complexions upon their return, the way they flinched at sudden movements, the hollow look in their eyes that spoke of things no child should ever witness. But asking questions about the Maddox family's private affairs was grounds for immediate dismissal, or worse. The rituals that governed Maddox family life would have seemed quaint to outsiders if anyone had been allowed to witness them. Meals were consumed in absolute silence, with only the soft clink of silver against china breaking the oppressive quiet. Communication happened through glances, through subtle gestures that had been perfected over years of practice. Every evening at precisely 8 o'clock, the family would gather in the main parlor for what Eleanor called reflection time. They would sit in their assigned chairs, never deviating from the arrangement, and contemplate the day's events in complete silence. Any breach of this sacred quiet was met with swift and terrible consequences. The children learned to communicate through their eyes, developing a language of fear that needed no words. They understood that their family's reputation depended on their absolute compliance, their complete surrender to the system that held them captive. They were taught that the outside world was dangerous, unpredictable, full of people who would never understand the Maddox way of life. Thomas had developed what he called the purification process, a series of increasingly severe punishments designed to remove any trace of defiance from his children's spirits. Eleanor supported these methods wholeheartedly, believing that suffering built character and that pain was simply love in its most concentrated form. The oldest son, William, had once tried to run away when he was 12. He was found 3 days later by the family's hired men, brought back to the estate and taken directly to the 3rd floor. When he emerged 2 weeks later, he no longer looked at windows with longing. He no longer spoke unless spoken to. The light that had once danced in his young eyes had been systematically extinguished. The family's twisted philosophy extended beyond mere discipline. They believed that their bloodline was sacred, that maintaining its purity required extreme measures. Normal human emotions, joy, curiosity, spontaneous laughter, were viewed as corruptions that needed to be carefully removed. Each child was a project to be perfected, a canvas to be stripped of its natural colors, until only the stark black and white of absolute obedience remained. But systems built on fear and control carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. And in the Maddox house, those seeds were beginning to sprout, fed by years of suppressed rage and buried humanity. The townspeople below began to notice changes that even the Maddox family's careful facade couldn't hide. Children who had once appeared occasionally in public stopped coming to town entirely. Months would pass without a single Maddox child being seen beyond the estate gates. When concerned neighbors inquired about their well-being, Thomas would smile, his cold smile, and assure them that his children were receiving the finest education at home, away from the corrupting influences of common society. Dr. Morrison, the town physician, would later recall being summoned to the Maddox estate 3 times in the span of 2 months. Each time, he was led through the house blindfolded, guided, only by Eleanor's firm hand on his arm. He was never told who required his services or what ailments he was treating. He would find himself in dark rooms, tending to patients he couldn't see clearly, their conditions mysterious and their recovery seemingly impossible to track. The servants began to disappear as well. Sarah McKenna, who had worked for the family for 7 years, vanished one autumn night without collecting her wages or gathering her belongings. Her replacement, a young woman from the next county, lasted only 3 weeks before she too disappeared into the night, leaving behind only whispered warnings about rooms that should never be opened and sounds that should never be investigated. Strange. Deliveries continued to arrive at the estate under cover of darkness, heavy packages wrapped in canvas and rope, their shapes suggesting contents that no respectable family should require. The delivery men were always strangers, never using the same messenger twice. They would arrive in unmarked wagons, complete their business in silence, and disappear back into the night like phantoms. The town's imagination began to fill in the gaps that reality refused to reveal. Stories spread like wildfire through the small community. Tales of torture chambers hidden beneath the elegant facade, of family members who had been locked away for crimes too terrible to name. Some whispered that the Maddoxes were conducting experiments on their own children, trying to perfect some twisted version of human purity. Others believed something even more sinister was taking place behind those locked doors. Then came the night that changed everything. October 13th, 1857, a date that would be burned into the town's collective memory forever. A violent storm had been building all day, the kind of weather that makes animals restless and sends children hiding under their beds. Lightning split the sky like the crack of God's own whip, and thunder rolled across the hills with the sound of the world ending. But even the storm couldn't mask what happened at the Maddox house that night. The first sign that something was wrong came from the lights. Every window in the estate, including those that had remained dark for years, suddenly blazed with an unnatural brilliance. The house seemed to pulse with energy, as if some enormous heart had begun beating within its walls. Then came the sounds. Screams erupted from the estate with such intensity that they could be heard over the howling wind. But these weren't the faint cries that had drifted down the hill for years. These were the sounds of pure terror, of human voices pushed beyond the limits of endurance. They rose and fell like a hellish symphony, punctuated by crashes and the splintering of wood. Several townspeople would later swear they saw figures moving frantically behind the lit windows. Shadows that seemed to be fighting, fleeing, or perhaps dancing in some macabre celebration. Mrs. Henderson, who lived closest to the base of the hill, claimed she could distinguish individual voices among the chaos. She spoke of hearing Thomas Maddox shouting commands that made no sense, of Eleanor's laughter rising above the storm like the cry of a banshee. The sounds continued for hours, sometimes fading to whispers, sometimes rising to shrieks that made the listener's blood run cold. Dogs throughout the town began howling in response, as if they understood something their human companions could not. The very air seemed charged with more than just the electricity of the storm. It carried the weight of years of suppressed horror finally breaking free. When dawn finally broke over the hill, an eerie silence had settled over the estate. The windows were dark once again, but now they seemed different somehow. Empty, as if the house itself had died during the night. It took 3 days for anyone to work up the courage to investigate. Sheriff Coleman, accompanied by Dr. Morrison and 2 volunteers from town, made the climb up the winding path to the Maddox estate. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The front door stood wide open, hanging from its hinges as if it had been forced from the inside. The elegant foyer was in ruins. Furniture overturned, paintings torn from walls, crystal chandeliers shattered on the marble floor. But it was what lay beyond the main rooms that truly defied comprehension. The locked doors throughout the house had been forced open, but not from the outside. The heavy iron brackets had been bent outward, the wood splintered in patterns that suggested enormous pressure applied from within. It was as if something had been trying desperately to escape from those sealed chambers. In the basement, they discovered a series of rooms that belonged in no family home. Stone chambers with walls stained dark with substances that Dr. Morrison refused to identify. Iron rings set into the walls at intervals that suggested human restraints. Medical instruments that had been modified for purposes no legitimate physician would recognize. And journals, dozens of leather-bound journals filled with observations written in Thomas Maddox's meticulous handwriting. The entries detailed experiments in what he called family purification, a twisted philosophy that viewed suffering as a necessary tool for removing weakness from the bloodline. Children who showed signs of independence were subjected to correction treatments. Those who questioned family authority were subjected to loyalty reinforcement. The methods described in those pages were too horrific for the sheriff to share with the town, though fragments would leak out over the years, becoming part of the Maddox legend. But perhaps most disturbing were the entries from the final weeks. Thomas's writing became increasingly erratic, describing voices that spoke to him from within the walls, promising him ultimate control if he would only complete the purification. The last entry, dated the night of the storm, consisted of a single line repeated dozens of times. "They are free, they are free, they are free." Of the Maddox family themselves, no trace remained. No bodies were found, no signs of where they might have fled. It was as if they had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind only the evidence of their terrible legacy. The house was boarded up within a week, but the boards never seemed to stay in place for long. Windows would be found open despite being nailed shut. Doors that had been secured would swing freely in the breeze. The townspeople learned to avoid the hill entirely, especially after dark, because the sounds had returned. They were different. Now, not the cries of the living, but something else entirely. Footsteps echoing through empty rooms, doors slamming shut with such force that the sound carried down to the town below. And sometimes, on nights when the wind was still, voices could be heard calling out from within those darkened walls. The Maddox estate became a place of legend, a cautionary tale whispered around fireplaces on cold winter nights. Parents would tell their children about the family that loved control so much they locked away everything good and decent about themselves, until only darkness remained. They warned that pride and secrecy were dangerous companions, capable of transforming love into something monstrous. Local historians have documented over 200 reports of strange phenomena at the estate since that terrible night in 1857. Photographs show shadows moving behind windows that should be empty. Audio recordings capture voices speaking in languages that predate the town's founding. And sometimes, just sometimes, visitors report seeing faces pressed against the glass, the faces of children who have been waiting far too long for someone to unlock the doors and set them free. The Maddox family thought they could control everything, even death itself. They believed their secrets were safe behind locked doors and iron brackets. But some secrets are too powerful to contain, too terrible to die with their keepers. And in that house on the hill, where silence once reigned supreme, the whispers of the past continue to echo through empty halls, telling anyone brave enough to listen that some doors should never be locked, and some families should never be trusted with the keys to their own darkness. The Maddox curse lives on, waiting for the next family foolish enough to believe they can master the art of perfect control.